So Josh, we're here at Lillklobbin in Espoo, and I would like to start with your story. If you tell me a bit about your background and about how you ended up here and how you ended up being a farmer.
Okay, well, luckily I've been asked that question a lot in the last few years, so I'll try to keep it short. Well, I'm from Florida in the United States originally, and studied history at the University of South Florida in Tampa. And while I was studying there, I learned about climate change and a number of other issues facing people everywhere, and tried to figure out something that I could do concrete beyond typical activism, which is mostly about protesting, writing letters, signing petitions, these kind of things. I was like, well, what could we actually do? And at the same time, of course, as many students, I didn't have all that much money, but I wanted to eat better food, so I became interested in gardening. And so gardening became an interest in organic gardening, became an interest in what's organic farming. Is there anything better than organic farming? What can we do? And so I just found that path to be extremely gratifying, to be outside working with plants and nature and compost and learning about all of these things that are happening around us. And I was introduced to permaculture at the same time by two different sets of people, and that was something that made a lot of sense. And then when I was reading, it's a pretty well-known 2-volume series now, the Edible Forest Gardens, Dave Jackie, and Eric Toensmeyer. 2 volumes. The first one's essentially a textbook on ecology. It's like a crash course on what would be the theoretical basis, essentially, for agroforestry. And it's like, okay, wow, they have citations that aren't to a blog post, that doesn't reference anything, right? And which is not always bad, but we have to, in history, you need to cite almost everything that you say, unless it's an original idea, which you don't have for the most part. You need to be citing where these things come from. So at that time in my life, I was super excited to pick up something that I could then reference and see what was going on. And I like to read textbooks, so it was good for me. And then I just started doing stuff, And I wound up in Finland because I also started dating my wife now. We met when I was traveling in Europe for 2 months, and we had a long-term relationship for a number of years. And after deciding I couldn't afford to go to another university out of my home resident state, I decided that I could move to Finland and give it a try, because I wanted to live outside of the States for various reasons. And so that was 7 years ago, actually. Almost 7.5 years ago, I moved to Finland. Started language program, did a few internships with people in doing urban agriculture. I'm not actually that interested in living in a city, but that's where I was in Helsinki. So got in touch with Dodo, and I did an internship at Pasila. And then while I was there, I met Jan, who has Staden Puutarhuri. He came by to pick up some plants, and I found out what he was doing, and then got there, and then he helped me find this place, which is Lillklobbin. And it's in Espoo. It's a 2.5 hectare property right next to a large highway, which doesn't bother me because I grew up next to pretty much as busy as this. And that's where my first permaculture garden was anyway, of my own, was right next to a highway. So it's sort of the same thing, different day. Yeah, back in the States. Yeah. And it took over a year to get all of the paperwork done to be here, because Espoo hadn't had anyone come to them. They have agreements with farmers who rent land from the city of Espoo, but they're doing traditional stuff outside of the dense, or when we're inside of this urban area. So this was a new thing for them, and they wanted to make sure that what they were doing, well, they could do it first of all, and that everybody was sort of, if you weren't on board, at least you were going to say okay, right? And so they couldn't say that, you didn't tell us. So they really put everything through the ringer. So I started then the very end of August 2016, and acting on a plan that I had developed over that previous year of interaction with the city and with visiting the site in preparation for starting. and used permaculture design to lay out the broad patterns of where I would want things. And the number one thing I wanted at the time was to have a what we call a market garden, so the smallest scale market garden that would make sense to earn a living with. Like, you can get a part-time income from something smaller than this, certainly, but if you wanted to theoretically make a full-time income, this would be like the smallest you should be able to use in our climate. It's less than 1,000 square meters of permanent beds. That number gets fuzzy once you start adding in all my hedgerows and things like this, but it's around 1,000 square meters of bed space. But we had to cut down a lot of trees, and so the trees, that took the first winter cutting. I didn't cut them down. I'm not allowed to cut down anything larger than, what was it, like 8 centimeters in diameter or something like this. There's a regulation that in the city you're not allowed to do that. So the city cut down the trees for me, and then I did the rest in terms of breaking them into smaller pieces, wood chipping the smaller ones, using the big logs for many different things, building beds, permaculture style, this kind of stuff. Then started laying out the market gardens in 2017, and the whole idea there is that you can start having cash flow in the first season by growing annuals, and cash flow is necessary with a small business. And that's the other thing that I'm trying to do here, is to establish a place that's putting permaculture design into practice on, of course it's not a permanent basis because nothing's permanent, but not needing to every year or whenever the project ends to go and ask for more funding from someone else, but also because that's a shortcoming that I saw with permaculture. And not just me, but a lot of people see this with permaculture, is that very often no one is using it in a professional capacity outside of consulting and education. It's like, where are the permaculture farms? And so that's what farmers say, where are the permaculture farms? So you kind of need to have a permaculture farm and say these things work. And yeah, it's a large enough site that the market garden is only one aspect of what I want to do here. We have over 1 hectare of space that I want to do sort of domestic scale permaculture patterns for teaching and things like this, but then also an area for a large-scale forest garden. And those plans were on the back burner because they cost more money to invest. It started with only 4,000 euros plus starttiraha, which paid my basic monthly income for a year once I put the extra applications in. I lost money the first year. I didn't inherit any materials, any tools, any infrastructure, so everything had to be done from scratch by myself. Because I also didn't want to rely on free labor, which is also a big problem with permaculture, is using free labor. And there's many, that's a whole different, maybe different topic. But I wanted to put in the sweat equity along with the capital equity and sort of earn my chops. And also, I didn't know what I was doing. I had read, I had seen, I had watched, but I hadn't visited. This is the first farm from the beginning, to my knowledge, the first farm in Finland that used permaculture design from the outset to design the patterns and then also help manage the subsequent unfolding of that farm. And the techniques with the no-dig in the market gardens and the cover crops and the standardized system and these kind of things. There are people doing a lot of these mixtures, but putting it into one package from the beginning and moving forward with that, this was the first one, so there wasn't anyone to go visit, because we'll get into it later, I'm sure. But when you go no dig, no till, which is a major part of what I'm doing here, not just in the market gardens, but everything is about the ecology and soil and ecosystem processes. Once you go there, it's a different paradigm from tillage agriculture. And so even the vast majority, and I say that because I'm sure there's someone out there who's doing it no dig in Finland, but they're not talking about it, just to cover my tracks there, the vast majority are tilling, organic, biodynamic, it doesn't matter, they're tilling their soil, and the results they get are different than it's a different paradigm than this. And that's a hard thing for most people to understand, because you can't readily see it for a number of reasons. But I'm doing a lot of different things here. Market gardening is the main thing, and started out small, pre-selling. I think I only raised around 500 euros of pre-orders the first year. I didn't even have any gardens though. I mean, nothing was made. They wouldn't deliver the compost until late April. And the trees hadn't been cleared away even by then, so I didn't even have a farm. So even to get 500 euros from a couple dozen people, 20 euros here, 10 euros there, was still, it's not a big risk, but it, you know, who's this guy? Oh, give him some money. And then the second year, things started moving forward, getting a little bit better. And the second year, I tried to do a CSA for the first year, but I just didn't have the time for it. So the second year, I scaled it back and made it more functional, which my friend Will was really nice handing me these terms to describe what I was doing from Alto. And more of a functional system, so they would get a certain amount of money value of produce every week or every other week on these terms, but it wasn't there wasn't very much community, and that's also something I'm not particularly interested in. It's complicated, but by the third, I mean, it grew and grew, and by the third year, like this year, this was the third growing season. I like to call it my second growing season, because that first year we didn't even have the gardens made, really. Like, we were still rolling out cardboard and compost in July. Like, and then one of the gardens, plot 8, I have 9 plots. Plot 8 wasn't made until end of September, early October, right when the garlic showed up, and I put some garlic in the ground haphazardly. Like, I was just like trying to pop it in there. And so to say that was a growing season is kind of, they also didn't even have water and irrigation until the middle of the summer anyway. But by the third year, I actually had to cut off applicants to the CSA because I raised my target revenue of 10,000 euros in pre-sales through the CSA model that we developed with a number of different people. And so that was really encouraging. And so it's like, I say 50 families, but it's like 50 shares, but I don't have one share. It's a very flexible system. The vacation options, different pickup locations, there are a big matrix of combinations of what people get and how much, so it's super flexible. And I think most people seem to be really happy. I've only actually had one person say that she didn't want to be a member anymore, but she actually wasn't even a member of the real I opened up continuation shares at the end, and she joined that, which wasn't the same thing. She wasn't satisfied, and we parted ways. But for the most part, people have been really happy. I also sell to restaurants. I sell to Reco. And it's been a crazy journey.
So maybe you can tell a bit more about what you actually have grown here, because I know that you've grown a lot of different. Yeah, well, this is something. Things. So yeah, it's sort of silly in one way, saying at the beginning there that I wanted to have the smallest scale market garden that works. Well, the smallest scale market gardens that work, and work being produce enough revenue per unit invested, time, money, whatever, they usually concentrate on less than 10 crops. The high value, high turnover crops. There's nothing particularly wrong with that, but that seemed kind of boring to me. Wasn't really that interested. I also don't have refrigeration, and most of the high value, quick turnover crops require refrigeration. The earth cellar that I had planned to use is not functional. I didn't know it at the time. I made a lot of mistakes when I started. I overlooked things or thought things would have been working in one way or another, and mostly through inexperience and a little bit of naivety. How do you pronounce that word? Naivisus. Yeah, say it in Finnish. Naivisus. Yeah, it has a Y at the end. It's hard to pronounce. It's not an English word. A little bit of that too. But we grow, like this year, looking at the harvest and sales data, there was something over 40 different kinds of vegetables, herbs, flowers. And so the largest focus I have are on high turnover, high value crops, but I also grow some lower value, long season crops as well. And surprisingly, some of those actually do better. So market research, I didn't really do any. I didn't really know how to do any. My Finnish isn't that great. It's okay. Especially now after a few years at Reco and talking to people who don't speak any English about these things. I know a little bit more now, but it's not the same food culture here.
And so high value, high turnover crops, unless I had found a particular niche and then market it directly to that niche, which would have really required somebody with a bit more business savvy than I had at the time to do. Like, I would have had to find those people. Sorry, garlic. Whereas in the States or in a lot of other large cities, the food culture is such that you wouldn't have to find a niche for those kind of products. They would just, most people would buy these like pre-cut baby size, not sprout or micro, but like baby size salad greens, things for eating raw, and not just lettuce, but lettuces, mustards, kales, tatsoi. Like there's spinach. People like spinach here, which is funny because it doesn't grow very well in Finland. But a lot of these crops, people just don't do, and it's actually a pretty traditional culture here still. People want to buy a whole head of lettuce and they want to buy it cheap and they want to make a salad with cucumbers and tomatoes on top. Like, that's kind of how it goes. All right, fine. And there are a few other things too. And also, I also found that people don't understand that food can be ready as early as it can be ready. And it's not just me who's found that. I've seen sales data from other outlets that it's very low, very low, very low. Then what you manage to do disappears in July because everybody goes away during the height of the season, but then it skyrockets in August when everybody comes back. And like, now it's the season for local food. And it's like, I've had food since May, So that's also been a difficulty. But I grow many kinds of lettuce, radishes, turnips, carrots, kale. I don't do any greenhouse production. I tried the first year. It was also one of the coldest, wettest years on record, and I have a small polytunnel, but there's no electricity there, so doing ventilation is all manual. And also there's no heat, and so when it's very cold and damp, tomatoes just don't do, and so they all died. I got a handful of tomatoes. I was like, not doing that again. And everything's done outside, pretty much. Yeah. I don't till. Now that has a big asterisk on the end of it because we have to disturb the soil a lot to get the perennial weeds out, since I'm not going to use any chemicals. It's not that I'm diametrically opposed to using an herbicide, but I imagine that my clientele would not have been happy if I had sprayed an herbicide to get started. Now maybe I would have been able, in some other places I think I could get away with that. But it also didn't end up being necessary, because I had the labor to do it eventually once I had interns coming to help me from the gardening schools. We don't till, we use compost. We use a certified organic fertilizer, which is made to feed mycorrhizal fungi. Part of it is water soluble, and the plants can access the nutrients the way they would access from any other fertilizer, but for the most part, the most of the mass it needs to pass through soil biology, especially mycorrhizal fungi, and then be transported to plants. And so I use one of those, and we start all the plants ourselves. It's a pretty complicated. I try to take as much control over the operation as possible, in part because, well, everything you outsource you have to pay for, and when you start with no money, you kind of have to do it all. But I've noticed the quality of plants in Finland are really poor. People don't even know what worm. Until a few years ago, it's been 7 years, but when I started worm composting, who knows? Why is it good? Who knows? Biochar, who knows? Mycorrhizal fungi, who knows? And it's like all of these things are standard practice in many parts of the States, and even in big box supermarket kind of shops, you can buy these high quality biological inputs. And like, you can't find it anywhere in Finland. So you have. And so I just started sourcing everything myself. I buy a lot of things from other countries because you can't find it in Finland. Or if you do find it, it's 4 or 5 times the cost. And some people try to rip you off. So yeah. And also, if you're going to do market gardening on the small scale, you have to intensify, which means more than 1 crop per season, preferably 3. Maybe 4 if you're really lucky, but definitely 2, right? In the same place, it's got to be at least 2. I mean, if you're not getting 2, then you're not going to go anywhere with that small space. So in order to get everything to sync up, I mean, you would need to have a really good relationship if someone else is growing your vegetable starts for you. So it's much better to do that yourself. And then you control the process from beginning to end, seed all the way to harvest, which is also really nice. Yeah, man. There's too much to talk about, really. But I'm mostly focused on that one area because I needed to get it going. It's a little engine that was supposed to produce the surplus revenue that I could then use to reinvest into the longer term systems and then diversify that way. I have been turning a profit for the last 2 years, but then once you start including salary, then you're not supposed to look at your salary as an entrepreneur in the first few years. Yeah. But, I mean, unless you're born with a silver spoon in your mouth, you have to look at the salary in the first few years and project it down and say, when is this going to turn around? And I see a lot of good things on the horizon for this place, but some of those mistakes that I made at the beginning in the planning process are not things that I'm necessarily willing to try to fix. So I'm also exploring other avenues to try to work with the real situation rather than trying to just pound it out.
So you have talked about that you here have applied permacultural design principles at your farm, and that you have followed particular sort of design methods and practices as well. And I'm wondering, because I know that you also associate and relate to regenerative agriculture, and that you yourself find different practices within that very sort of appealing, and apply them here at your farm as well. Can you explain a bit more how would you define regenerative agriculture, and why is that something that we should talk about?
Okay. I think I'll link permaculture and regenerative agriculture together really quickly, and so permaculture, the way that I see it, and the way that a large number of people who use permaculture see it as a toolbox. It's an ethical decision-making system, so it helps you put pieces together and ask the kind of questions that would help you arrange elements either in a landscape, in a business, an organization, whatever it is. And so it's a design system. And there are practices that people associate with permaculture, but of course they're not permaculture, they come from somewhere else. And one of that somewhere else's is this emerging idea of what regenerative agriculture is. And so regenerative agriculture, the way that I understand it, is from the American soil health movement in particular, which has really helped jumpstart this whole process worldwide. I know that other people are doing other things elsewhere, but when you get thousands and thousands of American farmers making a move across climates and things on large scales, and then being able to spread it because we share the same common language over 300 million people, things move rather quickly. And so regenerative agriculture for me is the idea that we understand that our land use, not just agriculture. I mean, agriculture kind of is a catch-all phrase, in my opinion, sometimes for land use in general, where we've degraded ecosystems. We've grossly simplified them, and in some places we may have simplified them beyond repair. And that this idea of sustainability, when you're talking about a system that is already degenerated, why would you want, this is what Gabe Brown says, why would you want to sustain a degraded resource? This doesn't make sense. And so we are looking at ways that we can actively improve the biological and ecological processes that would take place in that location. And then since it's agriculture, it's oriented towards supporting human beings. Regenerative agriculture is tangentially related to the other ideas of preserving and helping nature regenerate as well. The rewilding efforts and things like this, but this is clearly focused on production of things that are useful for human beings. And regenerative agriculture and the soil health movement has tried to come up with some basic principles that no matter where you are on Earth, besides a few places like Greenland or Antarctica, so none of these silly things, oh, well, what about this place or Tibet? And it's like, okay, look, we're not talking about extreme places. We're talking about where the vast majority of humans live. If you minimize and eliminate soil disturbance or And always the caveat with these things is that this is the ideal, this is the goal. Just like permaculture design ethics are, you're never going to be perfectly ethical in any of those things, no matter how you measure it. And so reduce and eliminate soil disturbance, tillage. If you're going to do it, understand what it does to the soil and know that you have a system in place to help repair that damage, because sometimes tillage is a useful tool. These things, and also to reframe things as tools that can be used in context. And so regenerative agriculture actually draws a lot from holistic management. And holistic management is its own decision-making system developed by Alan Savory and company, let's say it that way, because there's a lot of people over many decades, since the 70s. And so evaluating things and not saying, I will never use these tools. Say, what's the problem? What are potential solutions, and what tools can I use to address that? So sometimes tillage is a tool that might be necessary, but reduce and eliminate it, because it just destroys soil health. Yeah. It destroys the living organisms that are in the soil. And I mean, maybe I should explain why soil organisms are important, but I'm going to set that aside and just run through the principles. So reduce and eliminate tillage, keep soil covered. Soil, you shouldn't see soil.
Yeah.
So when you walk around this farm, there are places where you will see bare soil, and 9 times out of 10, or maybe 99 times out of 100, that's actually someplace I haven't started working yet.
Yeah.
You don't see bare soil on my farm. You see compost or wood chips, which are not exactly entirely regenerative in themselves, but that's a separate topic. That's to mimic the natural profile of soil. Soil has a profile. Bottom is bedrock. Limestone, granite, whatever. Bedrock, then you have subsoil, and then you have a assimilation layer. So that's where the organic material from the topsoil is being drawn by biology and gravity and water down into the subsoil, and and in good cases is getting as deep as it can, hopefully going to reach bedrock if possible, because the difference between topsoil and subsoil is life. Because it's actually life that builds soil and not just dirt. And these are all, this is a big kind of topic. And so, but on top of topsoil, like, ooh, we want beautiful topsoil. It should be covered. Because the way that the cycling works is that nature puts down dead, and it has living material, usually plants, on top of the soil. And that reduces the velocity of precipitation, because actually a lot of the soil compaction and the little thin crusting that happens on top of topsoil when it rains is because of the percussion of the rain. So you have something that slows that down and spreads it and lets it sink. It feeds, if it's a biological cover, it feeds the microorganisms that are in the decomposing part of the life cycle, because there's also another part of this cycle that's from the living, well, not really living liquid, but the liquids that the plants generate, these photosynthesis, that root exudates that they pump out from their roots. And so you're protecting all of that, and it keeps some of the heat in that these organisms are generating. So it's like a little mulch, it's a skin. It's like the skin on a human being. You're not going to be, you can take a few scratches, but if you rip your skin off, you're not going to make it very long, unless you go to the hospital. And that's what tillage does, is it rips the skin right off and even gets deeper and breaks things even further along. And so you want to have this protection on top. So keep the soil covered. There's a great saying, and it goes something like, brown is bad, gold is good, green is best. Brown would just be the average color most people think of soil as having. Yeah. You don't want to see soil. That's bad. We know that's bad. People can argue otherwise. It's not good for the environment. It's not good for ecosystems. Anywhere you look on Earth, besides where there's a landslide, a volcano, or some natural disaster, essentially, nature covers itself. Gold would be the color that dead organic matter often will take when it dries out. So think of like straw on top of the soil. So that would be like a mulch, and that's good. But the best is green, because it's the photosynthesizing plants plus their associated organisms in the soil that build the soil. So whenever possible, you want to have a living root And that's one of the soil health principles, is that have living roots as long as possible. But you don't want to just have living roots from one species, because one species has one set of potential root exudates and one set of partners in the soil that it can work with. Yeah. And so nature works in polycultures. We call them polycultures, they call it an ecosystem. So you want to have diverse living roots as long as possible. Some people make those two separate things, but put them together and say have diverse living roots as long as possible. So if you're going to plant a monocrop, which are advantageous in many contexts, you know that that's not building soil. You know that's not good for the ecosystem. So then you think, well, how do I repair that damage that I did to the soil by growing that monocrop? So you need to do something to repair that damage done to the soil. So what do we have? We have reduce and eliminate soil disturbance. We have keep the soil covered. We have diverse living roots as long as possible. And as long as possible is really important, because we focus on a narrow band of time when our cash crops will put on sufficient growth that it's worth having them around. But the actual time that plants could be photosynthesizing, protecting the soil and building soil aggregates and all the things that we need to happen in agriculture and just in land use in general is much bigger than, say, the 3 months or so that we have here in southern Finland. The grass is still green. There's a reason why people hate animals, but you know, having large amounts of your farm with grazing animals done properly, you're going to be storing more carbon that way. You know, actually the things that we have to set nature back and grow annuals, that's what should be minimized to the smallest amount possible. And so they're still keeping that soil alive. As long as it's green and the temperatures are right and they're photosynthesizing, then you're taking carbon from the atmosphere and you're putting it in the soil. And everything runs on carbon. And it runs on the plants doing that and all of this. So we need, as a farmer, you know, we have to pay for all these things. We have all this infrastructure. There are inputs still in many cases. But the one thing that we get for free, two things we get for free still, sunlight and precipitation. Those are the two things that you're going to get. And if you're not maximizing its beneficial impact on your operation, then you're depends on who you want to talk to and what incentives you want to promote, but you're losing money. Yeah. Or you're going to have to spend money to make up for that. And then the last one, which is controversial, not necessarily on farms, but with consumers these days, is integrate animals. There are no terrestrial ecosystems on the planet that don't have animals of some kind.
So it's part of the regeneration.
You can, if you do all the other principles and you don't integrate animals, you're going to see results. Good results. You integrate animals and you're going to start thinking, where's the limit on this? Because they offer things that machines can't do. You have to replace the role. If you're not going to use animals, you need to replace their function in the system. I don't want to have it. If you don't want to have animals in your operation, if it's not possible, then you need to think, well, what would they have been doing for me, and how do I replace as many of those functions as possible? They are simply, I think they're simply essential. Animals are simply essential. And there are a lot of operations showing how positive animal impact can be in just a matter of a couple of years. And so that would be another topic, but integrating animals. And that just helps farmers in general too, you know, to diversify. If you only have 2, 3, 4, or even 5 cash crops, many of those are probably in the same category. It's like rye, wheat, barley. It's like, is that really 3 separate crops, or is that cereals? I mean, it depends on how you want to talk about your operation, but when you put animals in there, it brings a whole nother dimension to the farm. Challenges, of course, but the improvements for soil health are there, and the improvements for, well, just even general enjoyment that people find when they bring animals back. And I would also say that, you know, we also need to think that even if we're talking about maximizing photosynthesis and doing all these things for the soil and trying to regenerate this resource that's the basis for all ecosystems, terrestrial ecosystems, is soil. We don't want to be myopic and look at 1 year. There are times when a large volcano goes off, sends enough dust in the atmosphere that people die. 100 years ago, 1800s, you know, we had the year without a summer. These things, are the volcanoes real? Yes. Do they have the potential to impact agriculture globally? Yes. What's green right now when it's, I mean, this is kind of what it would probably be like outside, you know, actually if something like this were to occur. What's still green and alive? It's grass. Can humans eat grass? No.
Yeah.
Okay, you can juice your wheatgrass all you want, but you're not going to make it through a year just juicing wheatgrass that you sprout on your windowsill. Like, those animals are going to be able to eat these plants that can grow in extreme circumstances. I mean, that's why the Sami people in Lapland aren't juicing wheatgrass. They're herding reindeer because they're alive and they're perennials. Animals are perennials. We're perennials, if you want to think about it that way. And so they're an investment and a storage and a safety feature that you can have on your farm. So integrating animals is key.
So this is really interesting. What I'm hearing is that regenerative agriculture, if you think what it is and what it's not, it's very much related to the soil health and these kinds of principles that you just mentioned. And I know that you yourself, since you have a market garden, which is really different from another type of let's say cereal or that kind of a regenerative production, right? How would you sort of what could you say about these two different ways of farming a market garden with various diverse vegetable crops that you can see on top of the soil, and then you just said what happens beneath the soil as well?
Yeah. Well, the problems with a market garden is that it's based on annuals. And your best annual, in good soil, they can get roots down pretty far. And it depends what kind of market garden you're also talking about too, because some market gardens are much larger than others and they have more space that they can, I don't even want to say the word can, because when you start market gardening with the systemic system, wow, that's terrible. With the system that like 40 Years made popular and that Curtis Stone has made popular, Richard Perkins has made popular. There are a lot of people doing this 75 centimeter bed, whatever the distance is, standardized beds, these things. It's become really popular. And what's been really interesting is to see how much production you can get on a smaller space. But of course that externalizes all the inputs, because the smaller the space, and if you make it so that you can't have a diverse cover crop. If you need to get 3 cash crops out of one piece of ground every single season in order to make your ends meet, it looks good from a square meter perspective, which, you know, a lot of our modern research on what sustainability is would be like, oh, that's great, but the inputs to keep that running have to come from somewhere, whether you're a conventional market gardener using synthetic fertilizer and pesticides, or if you're a certified organic or a biodynamic market gardener, those inputs are coming from somewhere, and what system are they coming from? And the thing with annuals is unless they're integrated into a program that revolves around soil health, then you're just outsourcing the problem, simply put. And so here what I've tried to do is set the market gardens within an a budding agroforestry system, as I like to call it, because I haven't had the resources to properly implement all of it. And so I'm actually relying on natural regeneration of the seed bank that's there to give me some of those trees and shrubs and things. And so it's not, you know, fully fledged. Nothing here is fully fledged. It's only 3 years old. And so I'm putting that within a system where hopefully some of these hedgerows will provide some of the biomass to mulch some of the pathways that need to be mulched, and also in a system where the farm itself isn't just the market garden. It takes up about 4,000 square meters if you incorporate the hedgerows and infrastructure, which is dual use, and roadways, which are dual use. And so it's a fraction of the landscape to begin with, and that the landscape as a whole can help provide some of those inputs into the system. And one of the things I want to do here is to integrate these soil health principles to the market gardens, because farmers are producing excellent crops, granted ones that are generally less nutrient and water hungry as vegetables, without any synthetic fertilizer or organic fertilizer besides what the plants do for the soil with the soil life, and then the animals do when they impact that whole system. So they're not moving compost. You couldn't move that much compost when you get to the scale that these people are working at. And the soil that they have is unbelievable. And so why can't we do that with the market gardening? And part of that's the scale, as I mentioned. So mine is very small, but I'm hoping that by having other revenue streams that I don't need to put the throttle to max on every single one of those beds. So for instance, this year I had an idea that I would have 2/3 of the gardens be high production, and 1/3 of the gardens would be one cash crop only, preferably a nitrogen fixing one like sweet peas, and then immediately follow that up with a diverse cover crop. And I don't have all the pieces yet on this farm for a number of different reasons. But I think that that's going to be the bridge, because market gardening, even in this really efficient system, it's really high-end organic even, or it's really it's efficient. You can produce a lot of food, but is it regenerative? I don't think so.
Yeah.
I haven't seen. But I haven't seen everything. But I don't think I've seen a market garden that I would call regenerative yet. I don't think that mine is.
Yeah.
I get a lot of influence from the regenerative thing, and that's where I'm on a path. And I think that's something that people need to understand, is that we all start somewhere on a path in our own context. And so I know where I want to go more or less, and it's going to take me some time to get there. And so I'm trying also not to make the perfect the enemy of the good.
So if I hear you correctly, how would you then, you talked about external inputs, and you said that the market garden needs still external inputs. It's not a closed system, if you will.
No.
Is there something in regenerative agriculture that there is a striving towards this closed?
Yes, it's one of the primary things is to reduce, and again, it depends on which of the beneficial outcomes of applying these practices, and of course the way of thinking that ties all of this together, because it's not a step 1, step 2, step 3. It's very much a practice of observation and adjustment as things change. And this is why a lot of scientists hate regenerative agriculture, because they can't study it, because you can't design a framework for it. It doesn't work. You can't tell a lot of farmers won't even work with scientists to approach them. We want to study your farm, but you need to do these things in this order. Like, that's not how this works. Sorry. But yeah, that's a big thing, because reducing the inputs means that more of the food euro, it's called the food euro, not the food dollar, stays with the farmer. And we need we want to reduce our costs. I don't think there's anybody who wants to buy stuff and bring it to their farm, like truly wants their farm to be running on that. It's different if you want to try different, like, oh, he's making biochar and he's got this kind of cool compost and they make this thing. It's one thing to tinker around with this stuff, but I don't think any farmer at the end of the day, when they're coming up with their budget, is like, I can't wait for all this money to leave my pocket.
So energy is one of the inputs as well.
Oh yes, massive.
And if you talk about large-scale regenerative agriculture, you need a lot of energy to move machines.
Well, if you had to move the compost and everything, a lot of the farmers are making their own biofuels.
And that comes from within
their own farms. Yeah.
So then it's
the machines, of course, have to come from somewhere, and they're externalizing that. But at the end of the day, if we live in a civilized society, and not like being nice to each other, but in a civilization, and not in a hand-to-mouth, or maybe we have a few years of security, but very small population, you can have all of the threads that support your life visible within, a few kilometers or a few square miles, but that's not the world we live in. We have 7 billion humans. And so we have to externalize some things. Like, we can't all just live off the land directly. So, I can't imagine trying to build a tractor. Like, better to leave that to the people who build the tractors. Yeah. But it is a lot of energy, of course. It's a lot of, so many of these things, it's all about energy, and that's one of the holistic management lenses, so to speak, that you use. I haven't looked at the exact terminology, but we actually look at energy cycling and also the energy that's used on the farm. And are you using what he called at the time in one of the first edition books was it solar or fossil dollars?
Okay.
And we want to maximize our use of solar dollars. So he was on this 40 years ago. Not the only one. Alan Savory wasn't the only one, but certainly got a lot of these things really good. Whoever they were working with, all these people putting this holistic management, they were on the ball even 40 years ago. And we don't want to use those fossil dollars. Or if you do, you need to maximize their impact. And being in Finland, fossil fuels are very expensive. Fossil energy is very expensive here. So that's one of the reasons why we have smaller machines and smaller fields, perhaps. I mean, it's also geography, and there's a number of factors. But I mean, of course, things aren't one-to-one copy. You can't copy it one-to-one, and it's not Saudi Arabia or someplace where it's basically free. State subsidized to the point where you can just drive around in the desert, do whatever you want. So we have to think about those things too. It's very energy intensive, and that's something that I try to remind people here all the time too. Is that I'm on a journey, and we're not going to make something perfect here either. Like, it's just not going to be possible, because you can follow every input and everything, all the tools that I use. I'm plugged into the industrial system, and all these farmers are. I don't really care where they are in Finland. I mean, if you're a farmer selling stuff for a profit and you're not homesteading, even then you're buying stuff from somewhere else. So the energy inputs are, and in northern countries use the most energy.
Yeah. We have the less sun.
Yeah, exactly. You'll die if you don't. So. Yeah.
And you've been following this regenerative movement, if you will, for quite some time, because you know how it got off in the United States, and you have been living here in Finland. How would you compare these two different ends of or different continents?
I would say Finland's 15, 20 years behind, despite the high level of English knowledge and the free accessibility to the same content that I'm watching from other places around the world.
Can you give some examples in which?
Well, the fact that I'm probably, I don't know how many there are, but I bet there are less than 10 commercial vegetable farmers in Finland doing no-dig. Doing no-till. We call it, when you do it on the market garden scale, usually you call it no-dig, not no-till. Okay. But they're more or less the same thing. Diverse cover crops. Now, people are using cover crops here. They're one species, two species, maybe three.
What about?
They're not 7 or 8 or 15.
The same.
The rotations are absent.
Yeah.
A lot of farmers are doing grain. Or it's not as if all the farmers in the U.S. are doing this, but it's moving very, very, very quickly. Yeah. It's moving so quickly that it's even catching the interest of some of the candidates for president this next time around. And some of the biggest American companies are on board with this. And so I think, if I'm being completely honest, one of the biggest problems here is that Finns have been told by international bodies that they respect that we're number one in almost everything. And instead of being we're number one because we question everything, it's we've been at the bottom of the pile so long, let's celebrate that we're number one, and they don't want to hear that actually we're falling behind. Falling way behind. And I'm not the only one who says this. So like Richard Perkins from Ridgedale, he says like he feels the UK is far behind. And so it's not just a Finnish thing. It's just that we're really, really far behind. I just see the bare soil, and that's the number one principle of soil health. And anywhere you go in Finland, it's just bare soil. You see people flipping their soil this deep, plowing this deep. At the end of the growing season, during our rainy season, that's going to leach everything away. And then people are like, yeah, siisti. And you're like, no. That's why the Baltic Sea is the way it is. We can blame the Russians as much as we want. I mean, they have their fair share of the blame, but to pretend that we're doing a good thing here it's terrible. Actually, we don't have much soil in this country. Yeah. This country came out of the ice 10,000 years ago, more or less. And there's hardly any soil, and we're wasting it, what little bit that we have. And that's, to me, it's incredible to see that people just think that this is somehow sustainable or good, and then, you know, people have such a high trust in what the organic people say, and the organic people are destroying the soil just as fast as the conventional ones. But because it's traditional, and because they, you know, don't use chemicals, somehow, you know, it's magically okay, and they're still making the water run brown. And it's just, to me, like, this has got to stop. But, you know, who am I? I just have a tiny little market garden. But I really do care about these things, because I think it's not just regenerative agriculture. We talk about the practices, but it's about human flourishing. It's about what makes people want to wake up in the morning. And what keeps our society going is the way we manage land. And you can see the reflection of the soil health and the health of the people. People aren't happy. We don't know what's going on. We don't know what we can do. But this offers some hope, because we don't know how good it can get. People who've been doing this conscientiously for decades, or even just five years, are turning things around. I mean, that's one of the things that gives all these people so much hope, is they can see one side telling them, you've used these chemicals and you've poisoned your soil and you'll never be good. And then comes along these other farmers saying, I was using the same stuff you were, and maybe even more. And in 5 years, I've got the best soil in the county. And it's like, wait a second. We were told that this would destroy everything. And it does destroy things, don't get me wrong.
So, what drives you to do this work, and why have you decided to earn your living by regenerating the soil?
Well, we don't have that much time to answer it, but everyone has to have a reason to get out of bed, if they're lucky enough to have a bed, in the morning. So I'm a firm believer that human beings are a product of evolution. That we have a niche somewhere on this planet, it's probably somewhere in East Africa, and that's where we came from. And we have a history that stretches to our ancestors, millions of years of interacting with the so-called natural environment. And we now know that even seeing green things for about 15 to 20 minutes can change your brain chemistry in a positive way. We know that soil organisms onto the soil, it's not just dirt getting dirty, but it's the organisms that our body responds to. We respond to subtle cues that are not conscious. There's so many, we are a problem-solving platform that knows it's going to die, and that knows that we can be hurt, knows we can hurt others, and we have a problem then. Knowing this, what are you going to do every day? And with evolution, it doesn't really tell you what you should do every day. The most basic answer is go and reproduce and have more kids. But that doesn't seem to satisfy us as human beings for very long, for the most part. I mean, maybe there's some people, that's great for them, like just really basic impulses. But for the most part, we've come to a point when we need something in our lives that makes it feel like all of this pain and suffering is worth it. And for me, usually this is only something I share after a couple of pints, and people actually want to talk about these kind of things. But I honestly believe that consciousness was in some way a gift to our species. However it came about, it was a gift to our species, because science is now showing us that we quite certain our star is going to die at some point. But before it blows up or collapses in on itself, whichever it is, I'm not an astrophysicist, but we know it's not going to be there forever. It's going to swallow the Earth. Before it swallows the Earth, it's going to boil all life as we know it off of it. So, there's a bit of an existential angst there. Maybe it's a few billion years in the future. But this planet with its biosphere, as far as we know so far, it's unique, at least in our neighborhood. And it's something beautiful. And even if it wasn't created by something supernatural, I think that life is such a miraculous thing and such a gift to everything that gets to experience it, that it's our job, that evolution may have created evolution so that some species would figure this out, that, wait a minute, this planet's in trouble. And now there's some people who are like, we'll go to Mars with ourselves and a couple potatoes, right? But we know that we're not just human, we're human and we have microbiology that influences our mood and our behavior. We're almost a moving little ecosystem. Not just humans, but all mammals probably. And so we are one part of the puzzle, and it's humanity's job to figure out how do we live in a way that makes life flourish, and that we can maybe take life somewhere else into the cosmos. And it sounds ridiculous maybe to some people, but that's really, it's a long way off. But if we don't figure out how we can even grow our own food, our own fibers for making clothes, for taking care of each other, for having something meaningful, if we don't figure it out, will another species figure it out? Does it matter? And so this is something that makes me excited, because it's like, wait a minute, maybe there's some, even I'm not always thinking about going to the stars, let's be honest, I'm not thinking about that. But I am thinking that I want to leave my daughter a world that's better than I inherited it. I heard stories from my father all the time about how when he was growing up, the animals that he saw, what they would hunt, what they would fish, what they would see, what they would do. And then, when I was growing up, they weren't around. These things aren't there anymore. It's like, oh, did you go to that spot? Yeah, the islands are still there. The tides are pretty much the same, because the U.S. actually does a pretty good job of protecting marine resources. No, we didn't catch anything. There's nothing there. Yeah. It's polluted. Red tide, which is really disgusting, wiping out dead dolphins. This isn't sustainable. It's not regenerative. And we need to live in a world that has all of the parts that we were handed to it when we figured out that, oh, wait a minute, this is me. Like, this whole world has such a long history of evolution that all of these, there's nothing unnecessary in this world. Everything is necessary, and extinction is one of the worst things that can happen, because even something that is an analog, very similar organism, can't fulfill that same function. And we don't know how long it will take before it could evolve into that function. Maybe faster than we think, maybe not. But this planet is actually rather fragile, and we need to do everything we can. And then to find out that you can actually produce lots of food this way, you can clean the water, you can bring back biodiversity, you can bring back excitement, you can have healthy communities. People want to become farmers again, they want to own land, they want to live out in the countryside where they can, when they're actually told they can interact with this miraculous thing, and not saying, only stay on the path, don't touch anything, you can only visit it during these hours. That's not really a human life. And I think that the most human life is the one that says you can interact. There are some rules though, but there's a lot of freedom as well. And so that's what gets me out of bed every day, is this idea that what we see around us is nowhere what it could be, and we don't know what the limit is either. That's the other side of the coin, is we're figuring out now that we don't really know just how amazing this planet could be. Part because we don't know what we lost. We have an idea of what we lost, but nobody was really keeping track of it as it was going. But now we do know. And once you know, you can't unknow, right? And so you can't go back after a certain point. You can't just say, oh, well, it's all. There are certain things, that I've picked up and dropped along the way, but for the most part, like the, care of the earth, care for people, redistribution of surplus, those permaculture ethics, like, I see them as guiding stars. Same way that I see keep the soil covered, diverse living roots, diversify your landscape. Like, I see those as guiding stars, and we're going to pick things up and drop them along the way. And that's what life is. I mean, if it was just, well, here it is, enjoy it, and you didn't have to explore and find anything, then you're not actually using your full capacity as a human. And that's what I want to see more people be in a position where they can be what I think, is what we are. We are something crazy and special. So.
Wow. Thank you, Josh, very much for this insightful time.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.